So let me welcome you. My name is Ken Stern. I am the director of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And I am so delighted that you're with us today with my friend Bill Morlin, who I've been desiring to come and speak at Bard for a long time, but he lives in Washington State in the Spokane area. To get him to the Hudson Valley, not the easiest thing, but to get him in front of his books to talk with us for an hour is an easy ask, and I'm delighted that he's here. I first knew of Bill's work way back when, and we're trying to figure it out, but I think it was probably around the Randy Weaver case, which you may remember, Ruby Ridge, in the early 90s was really one of the things that set up the militia movement of the mid-90s. And when I wrote a book about the Oklahoma City bombing, Bill reminded me of it, that so much of the research that I relied upon were the news stories that Bill wrote, including, he also had a role in the story itself, in the sense that Randy Weaver was a fugitive and Bill wrote a story. How come, white supremacists don't get arrested by the marshals when other people do? That's one of the important points of the unfolding of the story. But one of the things that I felt for many years watching Bill and reading his work was that if he weren't in Spokane and writing mostly for the Spokesman Review, there would be a lot more notice of his writing because it was so exceptional. If you were writing for the Times or the Washington Post, many more people would know about it and take it as a model. Because he wrote about the people that were white supremacists and extremists and threatening and violent, but he wrote about them in a way that wasn't dismissive. It didn't look at them as caricatures or cartoons. You could recognize them as people following ideas with strong identities. And that was an important aspect of understanding what the threat was and giving some capacity for people to really think through what they should do. So what I'm going to do is introduce Bill with some of his bio, turn it over to him. He's going to speak for about a half an hour. Then we'll take questions and answers. And I encourage you, you don't have to wait for the Bill to finish. If you have questions that you think about along the way, put them in the Q&A box. I will then moderate the questions in the aftermath, and we'll finish up at the top of the hour. So, Morlin has been a journalist since 1967, from 72 to 2009. He was a reporter for Spokane's daily newspapers, specializing in investigative reporting, criminal justice issues, and extremism. He covered the Aryan nations and various offshoot extremist groups engaged in violent criminal activities and domestic terrorism. That work took him from the Aryan nations compound in North Idaho to various courtrooms and extremist enclaves throughout the United States. He's interviewed dozens of racists, probably more than dozens, covered demonstrations, cross burnings, rallies, and federal and state trials of white supremacists accused of assorted violent crimes. He's written hundreds of articles about white supremacists, the Order in the 1980s, Ruby Ridge in 1992, the birth of the militia movement, the Montana Freemen in 1996, so-called sovereign citizens, Phileas Priest bombers, and assorted anti-tax and anti-government groups. And he testifies as an expert witness on these groups in both state and federal court trials. More recently, he wrote about the 2016 Malheur standoff in Oregon, the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, and the Bundy trial in Las Vegas in 2017, and Patriot Prayer Proud Boy rallies in Seattle and Portland the following year. After retiring from the Spokesman Review in 2009, he taught journalism for 2 years at Gonzaga University, and then began an 8-year stint continuing to write about hate crimes and domestic terrorism for the Southern Poverty Law Center. He's a nationally recognized expert on domestic extremism and is frequently called upon by academics, human rights groups, and documentary film and podcast producers, as well as the New York Times. So, Bill, let me turn it over to you. Thank you again for spending this afternoon with us. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Ken, and I appreciate the invitation, and attendees watching. I appreciate you giving up some of your time to listen to what we're talking about here today. Even though some of this is historical, in my opinion, has a huge bearing on what we're seeing, on today's political landscape. So everybody's going to want to know, how does a basically a poor kid from Spokane end up getting involved in covering white supremacists and extremists and neo-Nazis? And I actually continue to ask myself that question. After I got my college degree, I ended up working as a daily newspaper reporter. And one day in the early 1980s, I heard that a cross was going to be burned at this rural ranch homestead place up in North Idaho. And in my entire life, I'd never heard of crosses and Ku Klux Klan's gatherings here in the Pacific Northwest. And it just struck me as out of the ordinary and quite frankly a bit horrific. And so with that first cross burning, I volunteered, told the editor that it was something that I thought we should pay attention to. The cross burning was going to be late on a Saturday night at what turned out to be the Aryan Nation's compound, which is north of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, in Kootenai County, Idaho. So photographer and I wandered up there, and in short order, I got my first taste of the Aryans when they pointed a rifle barrel at my head as I attempted to drive into the compound. They made it very clear that members of the media, they called us Jews media, were not welcome, and that we ought to turn around and get the heck out of there as soon as possible. So that's exactly what I did. And I wrote an opinion piece or an analysis piece for the Spokane Daily Chronicle about that experience. And then, as it would turn out, month after month, year after year, elements of the Aryan nations would be committing criminal activities, and they would find themselves, under arrest or in the courtrooms throughout the country. And so I just developed, a pretty deep interest in the topic, and my editors allowed me to continue, building an expertise in that area. They asked me repeatedly if I would like to, go cover, something else like high school football games or anything else other than these extremists that present such a danger. But I found it interesting, and I was determined to sort of do a deep dive into it. And so now for the last 40 or so years, that's exactly what I've done. So I think the best way to talk about how journalists should respond to these folks is I'm going to walk through some photographs of things that I've done. And can you all see that now, Ken?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, all right. When I do these presentations, frequently I'll flash this picture on the screen, and I did so for a group of young college-educated business folks here in the Northwest a couple of years ago, and I asked them, "Who is it? Who knows who this man is?" And fewer than maybe a third of the people in the audience recognize this man for being Richard Butler, the founder of the Aryan Nations, the Church of Jesus Christ Christian, a white supremacy brand, a Christian identity that set up shop. And it's my belief that Butler, in fact, what he preached and what he did in the 80s and 90s has had a profound effect on far right, the alt-right, and the extremism that we see in today's world, particularly here in the United States. At the time, he didn't always generate a lot of national attention, but he I believe brainwashed and taught several generations of folks that are still out there. Butler came to North Idaho from California in the mid 70s. In 1974, Spokane hosted a World's Fair, and a lot of people suddenly discovered the Northwest, and Butler was one of those people. And at that point in time, the Northwest was largely predominantly white. There weren't many minority folks. There were some indigenous peoples here, on different reservations and in our communities, but it wasn't, there weren't a lot of minority folks here. And Butler decided that he would call the Northwest and the 40 acres that he bought in North Idaho a white homeland. It was his dream and part of his overall mission. Butler was creative, and he was not very articulate, but he was very creative. He managed to meld Christian identity, this white supremacy, British Israelism brand of hate religion, essentially, with National Socialism. He thought Hitler was a wonderful guy, and so he appealed to both Christian identity followers as well as National Socialists, neo-Nazis, and skinheads. And I can't think of another extremist leader really in modern day in the United States who was able to sort of do that sort of ecumenical outreach and reach out to racists who are Christian identity folks, National Socialists, and even Odinists and other people who were believed in pagan gods. So he was a melting pot. He was essentially a United Nations, if you will, for bringing all these folks together. And he did it under what he called the Aryan World Congress. And he started hosting these Aryan World Congresses usually every July. The first one he held was actually in Hays, Kansas in 1980. But after that, every summer, usually in July, he would host a 3-day gathering there on the Aryan Nations compound on Rimrock Road, north of Coeur d'Alene, sometimes called Hayden Lake, Idaho. And there would be somewhere between maybe as few as 100, sometimes as many as 300 or 400, and maybe even upwards of that. And so these folks from all over, I mean, I saw people there from Pennsylvania and New York and Canada and Texas and California and from elsewhere in the West would get to know each other. And this was pre-internet. So it was a perfect opportunity for these people to make connections and network with each other. And that's exactly what happened there at the Aryan Nations. One of as I indicated, he not only lured in neo-Nazis and Christian identity believers, but he also had a strong following in the Ku Klux Klan. And a lot of people that would show up for his Aryan World Congress were Klansmen. The man on the right, I believe, is Thomas Robb, who is from Arkansas and is still active in the Klan activities in Arkansas. And Butler would conclude these 3-day gatherings with cross burnings, or on occasion, he would also have large swastikas wrapped with burlap, and he would burn swastikas alongside the Christian identity white crosses, so familiar with the Klan. So he was really attracting quite a following. And he also was prolific in his compound. He had a church where he conducted his Christian identity church services on Sunday, but he also had an office and a printing press. And he printed newsletters, and he targeted prison ministries, as he called it, with letters that he would send to inmates at various prisons. Many of those inmates, when they got out of prison, they had no place to go, and Butler had a bunkhouse on his site. So many of them from elsewhere in the United States would transition to North Idaho and live on the Aryan Nations compound for a period of time. Now, I have to tell you, many of these folks went on to get into trouble with the law. And as I look back at the dozens, hundreds of stories that I actually wrote over this period of 30, 40 years, the stories were not to promote Richard Butler and his belief system. It was most of them, if not all of them, were related to the fact that some members of his following or of his church group had committed crimes, and not just minor crimes, but serious crimes, assassinations, murders, counterfeit money, bank robberies, armored car robberies. And one of the most notorious groups that came out of there was a group called the Order. It was formed, and these folks essentially hooked up at this Aryan World Congress and decided, they got a little tired of listening to Butler blab on and on. They decided the time had come to actually do something. And so this ragtag bunch of guys got together after meeting at the Aryan Nations, and they followed the lead of this man, Robert Matthews, and a dozen or so of them stood in a circle around a white baby in a rural cabin in northeastern Washington, and pledged themselves to a race war that they thought was inevitable. They were tired of just listening to Butler talk about, doing things for the white cause. They actually wanted to, bear arms and develop an army and actually start doing something. And that's just what they did. That happened in late 1983, and by 84, they were committing a string of crimes. They held public demonstrations, and protesters showed up and protested. The man on the right there on your screen is Bob Matthews. And but meanwhile, behind the scenes, unbeknownst to law enforcement and unbeknownst to everyone else, they're also committing a whole string of crimes. And one of them, they started by printing counterfeit money, using the presses at the Aryan nations, distributing the counterfeit money to their would-be followers and other members that they wanted to bring into these different cells they were creating. And then they started committing bank robberies, armored car robberies, and one of their members was David Lane, who was a Ku Klux Klan member from Colorado, and he'd been kind of upbraided by a radio host in Denver, a man by the name of Alan Berg, and they had words with each other on the air on Berg's talk radio show. And Lane proposed to members of the order that maybe the time had come for one of the first things for the order to do would be to assassinate Berg. And that's exactly what they did. They followed the book, The Turner Diaries, which was written by this man, William Pierce, now the late William Pierce, who had a similar organization, much smaller than Butler's, called the National Alliance. Pierce had shown up at least one, maybe two or three Aryan World Congresses. We reporters were not allowed into the Congress during its actual goings on. We spent the whole summer essentially, or that 3 days of that summer on the county road out in front of the place, seeing who was coming and going, but we were not allowed in there. Usually Butler would allow the media in on the Friday before the convention began, and it was a photo op, that we could take pictures of these guys and see who was there. And as Ken pointed out at the start, my intention was to not grandstand these people or not paint them as a bunch of clowns, but really take them as for who they are and what they talked about, and to sort of strip them down for their hatred and the message of terrorism that they were really talking about. And of course that involved a lot of research and getting the literature that these individuals promoted, reading about it, and then talking to experts like Professor Stern there and the ADL and SPLC, and talking to them and say, okay, who is this person, and how seriously do you take them, and and how can we counterbalance the message of hate that these people are spewing? So, and some of this, I have to remind the younger viewers that much of this occurred pre-internet. So we didn't have the quick 1, 2, 3 click kind of access to background information that's out there now. But anyway, so these the order went on and committed this whole string of crimes, and it took actually several weeks before the FBI actually realized that having one agent in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, dealing with the Aryan nations and the presence, and the fact that it had been the seedbed for this group called the Order, and that there's now a group of domestic terrorists operating in the United States, and they came out of the Aryan nations. All of a sudden, the FBI found a gun at one of these robberies and decided, they did the trace on the gun and found out that the individual involved, where he bought the gun, and that there were some connections with the Aryan nations. Some of the counterfeit money started turning up in Philadelphia, and one thing led to another, and pretty soon the FBI had amassed a huge task force of agents here in the Northwest, trying to track down and arrest these 1 to 2 dozen individuals who had become members of the Aryan nations and were divided up now into different cells. And I've often noted that if the same scenario had occurred in, say, upstate New York or Florida or Virginia, for example, or anywhere, even in one of the larger Midwestern cities, that what was going on would have gotten a lot more of attention. All of a sudden, you've got a group of domestic terrorists on the loose that are committing murders and assassination, distributing counterfeit money. They bought a training camp. They're now arming their folks, and they're getting ready for what the Turner Diaries calls the day of the rope. And I like to mention that because those of you who saw the events of January 6th may have noticed that one of the photographs was a noose hanging there on the Capitol Mall by some of the proud individuals who got involved in that insurrection effort. And that clearly is a reference to the Turner Diaries, because the Turner Diaries talks about the day of the rope, when white warriors, prevail and start rooting out and killing and assassinating and, getting rid of, people that they view as their enemy. And of course, their biggest enemy is the government, the federal government, what they call the Zionist occupied government, or ZOG. You'll hear that term frequently, ZOG. And it's something that Butler talked about. He was one of the early messengers of hatred of the federal government. Butler, I should tell you, before he came to North Idaho, got early training, I guess, for lack of a better word, in the John Birch Society. But that wasn't quite strong enough for him, a strong enough flavor. Then he graduated to the Posse Comitatus, which is another Christian identity, sovereign citizen, we'll be our own local township type government system. And then finally he evolved into the Aryan nations. But anyway, along the way, so in the 80s, in 84 and 85, I was covering the order. By those folks were arrested at a racketeering trial in Seattle. It lasted from September to December of 1985. And everyone thought, okay, now they've arrested the bad guys from the Aryan nations and it's all going to be good again. That didn't happen. It wasn't long thereafter that another group, the Order 2, popped up, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Simultaneously with the presence of the Aryan nations, the good folks at Kootenai County started a human rights task force, and they decided we just can't sit by. We've got to offer some counterbalance. We need to expose these folks and and bring people of goodwill together to counteract. And they've done just some amazing work over the years in that regard. They have actually become a prototype for other human rights organizations around the country. When the Aryans, for example, would parade in downtown Coeur d'Alene, the members of the Kootenai County Task Force, and this was their logo, would hold what they called Lemons to Lemonade, and they would raise money from donors for every minute that the Aryans and the Nazis were marching. They would collect money, and they used that money to further civil rights and human rights education among fifth graders in the school districts of North Idaho. Back to the original underlying theme of this, and so the newspaper that I worked for, decided that we needed to give equal ink to the good people counteracting the Aryans. And so my colleague David Oliveira spent a lot of time with the task force. They and would write about their goings on and what they were doing, and they would have regular events, and they ended up winning a couple of national awards for their grassroots human rights effort. So when I do these talks, I can't not mention the fact that Tony Stewart and Norm Gissel and Marshall Mend and a host of other folks who were involved with the Kootenai County Task Force just did some wonderful counterbalance work to kind of balance out the nastiness and the hate and vile that was coming from Richard Butler. And all these folks are in the same community. And so the people in the human rights network over there were the targets of many threats and violence. And this is a picture of Alan Berg, the Denver talk show host, who was assassinated by members of the order simply because he was Jewish and because he stood up to the nasty, vile stuff that Butler and these racist followers of his were talking about. There was a lot of details and sort of the underlying notion of what the order was all about, and references to the Aryan nations first really publicly surfaced at the order trial in Seattle. And that's where first there's testimony and evidence introduced by the federal government at that trial, which, by the way, resulted in convictions for all those accused of this racketeering charge. Racketeering, as you may know, is an umbrella charge, and under the racketeering charge are the various predicate acts: murder, counterfeiting, possession of stolen weapons, et cetera, that are under the racketeering. The racketeering is kind of a catch-all charge to get these people into the courtroom, get them convicted, and send them off to prison. When I last checked, I think there are still 2 members of the order in federal prison. Other members have died. A couple of them have seen the errors of their way and have converted back to a less violent lifestyle and religions of their choice that are not Christian identity. After the order, there was the order too, and one of the things they did was bomb the home of this man, Bill Wassmoth, who was a Catholic priest in Coeur d'Alene. He was one of the original members of the Kootenai County Task Force, and they targeted him simply because he was involved with the human rights thing effort there in Coeur d'Alene. He went on to become the executive director of the Northwest Coalition Against Hate, which involved 5 or 6 states: Washington, Idaho, Montana, Colorado, and Oregon. And it was just an amazing human being who saw firsthand, what this kind of hate can result in. When they come to your house and plant a bomb with the intention of killing you, it sends a shiver down your spine. And no one knew that better than Bill Wassmoth. He passed a few years back after a lengthy illness, but he was one fine fellow and did a lot for civil rights. Turning the clock ahead, Ken mentioned the case of Ruby Ridge. One of the individuals who showed up at the Aryan Nations was a fellow by the name of Randy Weaver. And Ruby Ridge would have never happened had it not been for the fact that Randy Weaver went to the Aryan Nations. And at the Aryan Nations, he met a federal informant, and the federal informant convinced Randy to saw off some shotguns. The informant was posing as a biker, kind of a tough guy who was going to take these sawed-off shotguns to California and sell them to other people, apparently, who wanted to use them against black street gangs. And so Weaver sawed off some shotguns and got charged, got indicted, and then refused to come down from his mountaintop. So in 1992, one of the stories that, again, came out of the Aryan Nations was the saga of Randy Weaver, and I won't go into all those details. I presume many of you know about it, but this was the cabin that Randy Weaver lived in North Idaho at about the 4,000-foot level. It's short, it's close to the Canadian border. They get 10 to 12 to 15 feet of snow there in the winter. The cabin now is all gone. The snow has taken its toll, and it's no longer there. But it was there in 1992 when a federal marshal was shot and killed, and Randy Weaver's wife and daughter, his wife was also shot and killed by an FBI sniper during the 10-day Ruby Ridge siege. Randy testified at a federal U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee in 1995 and publicly said that it was, he regretted the fact that he had not come down off the mountain and surrendered. He ultimately went to trial on the shotgun charges and was essentially acquitted on all of them, and now has sort of drifted into the background. But at the same time, he still is really a martyr and a hero for the far right, and people still know the term Ruby Ridge and Randy Weaver. Again, on the stories that I wrote about this, my colleague Jess Walter, actually after the Ruby Ridge siege, went back to Iowa and tracked down people who knew Weaver when he was there working in I think a tractor factory or something like that. And it's like, who is this man? How did we get to where we're at? And so I think the important ingredient for journalists and researchers is to sort of dig into the past of these individuals. How did Richard Butler come to live in North Idaho and become this sort of folk hero leader for the far right and these racists that he was attracting from all over the country? And in fact, even from Germany and Canada and other countries were coming to see Butler. Likewise with Weaver. How did this situation come about? And so that reporting was done, and I think those deep dives are just very important for researchers to not just take the quote or two and splash it out there, but to really do a lot of research. Unfortunately, and I don't mean to criticize my brothers and sisters in the broadcast media, but when you're a broadcast person and you have 3 minutes on the evening news to talk about the Aryan World Congress, you're going to get bits and snips, and you can't really fully go into the details about who these people are and the viciousness of what they're all about. So I think I'm fortunate that I was working with print media, not only print media, but a newspaper that was willing to spend money and resources to allow me and other members of our staff, including Dave Oliveira, to continue to follow the human rights work and continue following the various trials. And these trials occurred in Denver and Fort Smith, Arkansas, and Seattle. And these folks were not just in the Northwest. Most of them moved to the Northwest, but they were from elsewhere. During Ruby Ridge, there was a huge turnout of white supremacists. Butler was there, neo-Nazi skinheads, and a lot of townsfolk. And the FBI, meanwhile, was up at their base camp, and it was tough to really find out what the federal government was doing. And I scold the FBI for not, being more open with the American public through the media and telling us firsthand what was going on up there. It was Bo Greitz, kind of a far-right patriot himself, who came down and told the press corps and others gathered there at this roadblock that Vicki Weaver had been shot, fatally shot. The FBI didn't announce that. And at the roadblock, we could not see the cabin at that remote site that I just showed you. So the press corps and all the networks were there, and print reporters from all over the country were there. We could only really deal and interact with the protesters and the friends from the area. So it was a difficult story. And as I've told other people, this was at a time when the U.S. government was allowing journalists to be embedded with U.S. Army forces in Iraq. I mean, we had journalists on the front lines in Iraq, but somehow, on the front lines at Naples, Idaho, journalists were kept a mile away from the action. And so I think a mystique and conspiracy theories and some of that started to set in because of that. And the FBI, I don't believe, handled it as forthright as might have been. But out of Ruby Ridge came this guy and many others. It was what the Ruby Ridge essentially became the seedbed for the birthplace of the militia movement. And this man, John Trockman, was one of the militia movement's first organizers. Louis Beam, the former Texas Ku Klux Klansman, who had been the Aryan Nation's ambassador at large, also was involved in starting to formulate small militia groups around the country, and I mean everywhere around the country. And so but this man, John Trockman, the militia of Montana, became sort of the boilerplate image of the militia movement. And their essential message is we will never let another Ruby Ridge occur. We will never let the FBI move in on an individual in a cabin and get involved in a gunfight. They saw themselves as attempting to intervene. And again, that was a message that you don't just talk about a militia group and a bunch of guys out in the woods practicing Army games, but actually explaining that they're ready to go toe-to-toe with federal agents, and that they really present quite a threat. And then, of course, turning the clock ahead to 95, we had the horrible example at Oklahoma City that resulted in the 160 plus deaths. The man involved in that, Timothy McVeigh, as many of you know, also was sort of led or influenced by the Turner Diaries that had been written by William Pierce that I mentioned a moment ago. So this Turner Diaries book is this recurring theme that we see over and over again, or we have seen over and over again. And it's a fictional account of a race war. But some of these people think that that's the blueprint for them, and they've taken it seriously and put it into action. That sounds far-fetched, but that's just what's happened in U.S. history. One of the horrific scenes. This was the FBI base camp. We could not, at Ruby Ridge, we could not see this at the time. There were hundreds of FBI agents there and state and local law enforcement folks. As you can see, they had helicopters and they didn't really know what to do. They unfortunately were given some misguided instructions about what to do. And there was the now famous shoot to kill order that allowed the FBI hostage rescue team to shoot and kill anyone they saw with a firearm. And that's what resulted in the tragic death of Vicki Weaver, Randy Weaver's wife. Again, another picture of Ruby Ridge. The militia movement also resulted in a lot of smaller groups around the country. This was an individual in Montana who was upset with the fact that he wanted to raise elk in his own fenced yard, and the state game officials were not having that. They said it was illegal, and so it set off once again a conflict between local citizens armed, thinking that they have some kind of constitutional right to raise elk when the state game officials say, no, you don't. And so that's a recurring theme that, that people like Butler and some of those early people involved in this movement, many of them hated the IRS. Others thought that the ATF was coming for their guns. Others, like this individual, thought that there were restrictive game things, that they ought to be able to raise elk in their own private areas. Others thought the Forest Service, the restrictions were too great regarding mining claims. And so the recurring theme that we see in this alt-right, far-right extremist movement is individuals that are brought into it versus the federal government, which is exactly what happened it happened at Ruby Ridge, but it also happened at the Bundy Ranch in 2014, when the Bundy family thought that they should be able to graze, their cattle on public lands and not pay any minimal lease fees. So, and now we've evolved to, the current anti-government thing is the whole vaccine thing. It's the evil government telling us we have to get vaccinated. So it's individual versus all these things that the government is laying out there. So you ask yourself, okay, what's going to be next? This was an individual that was involved. Again, he thought if the Federal Reserve could print and distribute money, that he would have his own school in Jordan, Montana in 1996 and teach people how to have sovereign citizen courts, get judgments against public officials, and then start writing checks that were obviously not worth the paper they're written on. And ultimately, the FBI had to circle the place, and they learned their lesson from Ruby Ridge. They came to Jordan, Montana, and not a shot was fired. There were no deaths, and it was the longest siege in FBI history. It resulted in, I think, an 86-day siege. I was there, and again, I as a journalist, I wanted to take a deep dive. Who are these people? Where are they at? And you can't learn that information or develop that information sitting behind a desk. You've got to get out there. And unfortunately, even with Zoom and cameras and so forth, I still tell young reporters that don't wait for the handout to come over the email or the instant message. Get out there and get in the airplane. In this case, I wanted to fly over the compound so I could see what the buildings look like. And so fortunately, I found there was a coyote hunter up there that was a local guy. And so it was in his plane, because I figured the Freeman on the ground would recognize his plane. I didn't want to get in a strange plane and get up there and get shot at. This is what the buildings look like. And the FBI is faced with the question, okay, we've got these anti-government types here. How are we going to get them out of there? We learned a lesson at Ruby Ridge. We can't send the SWAT team out there with a shoot to kill order. And so they essentially waited them out. And so it was a big lesson. But even after the Montana Freeman, there were still militia groups that came out of Oklahoma City. And in 1996, the editor of the Spokane paper assembled a group of us reporters to find, are there really militia groups out there? Are these secret cells really out there? Or is it just somebody's imagination? And so my assignment was to actually to locate and to interview and to find out who are these people, where are they getting their money, and so forth. So I located this group through an intermediary. But when on a cold November Sunday, when a photographer and I visited them up in the woods near the Idaho-Montana border, Canadian border, they were all masked, and they referred to each other by number. They would not give me their names. I only knew the name of the intermediary that took us there. And it was fairly shocking. And these people had literally state-of-the-art equipment. They even had on some kind of a netting that would prevent their body heat from being seen by aircraft with heat detection equipment on it. Sometimes they will fly over an area, and the heat from the human body can be detected by by an aircraft. And of course, these people are all paranoid about Zog. They think the government's watching them at every moment, when in fact that's probably not the case. But anyway, these individuals, we filmed them and wrote about them, and they were all masked again, and they wouldn't tell me who they were or where they were from. They also wouldn't tell me how they were paying for this rather exotic equipment that they had. And anyway, some of those photographs that I just showed you, one of them ended up on the book cover of a book that Morris Dees wrote in early 1996 called Gathering Storm. And it was about the militia movement. It was much like Ken Stern's great book called Force Upon the Plain, which if you haven't read it, I would urge you to do that. But anyway, those militia folks that I just showed you, they were upset with the fact they didn't have a problem with me writing about them and documenting it in a special section in our Sunday paper, but they were angry that Morris Dees had bought those photographs from the Spokesman Review and had used them in his book. And Morris Dees has always been enemy number one, or certainly, at least a rivalry for enemy number one in the far right extremist world. And so they decided they would send a message. So they built a pipe bomb and came to the Spokane Valley office of the newspaper I worked for and set off a pipe bomb that would have killed people if they'd been around. I was in Jordan, Montana at the Freeman standout at the time, but it was one of those moments where when you read about the fact that a pipe bomb has just gone off at your newspaper, it's like, who might have done this? And what is their motivation? At the time, of course, I had no clue that it was these same militia guys that I had interviewed a few months earlier up in North Idaho. But with the passage of time, by the fall of '96, those individuals had been arrested, and lo and behold, they were some of the same people that I caught, those masked individuals up in the woods that we'd photographed. I'm about to wrap this up, but one of the other impacts that the Aryan Nations had on the city of Coeur d'Alene was, in conjunction with these Aryan World Congresses every year, they would get a parade permit and march right down the main street in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, which is a beautiful lakeside community. And they would shut down all the businesses. Huge economic impact, which again was something that my colleagues and I would report when we wrote about these. I believe they conducted 4 or 5 of these parades between the mid to late 90s, clear into 2004, and in fact, and so this parade attracted again this whole milieu of far right hate mongers. You'll see the guys in the blue shirt are Aryan Nations members. There are Ku Klux Klan members there, neo-Nazis, some of them dressed in World War II SS uniforms. I mean, it was just a wide assortment of the far right. Again, most of these folks are not from the Northwest. They migrated here because Butler and the Aryan Nations had become a magnet for their activities. Here's a photograph of Butler at one of those gatherings. But not all the hate mongers were in the parade. And again, here's something that I think members of the media and so forth need to pay attention to. This woman is giving a Heil Hitler salute behind the police tape. She wasn't in the parade, and I believe she has a Ku Klux Klan logo on her ball cap and is holding what appears to be a Confederate flag. So telling the readers that all the hate mongers aren't necessarily the ones that we're seeing on television or being photographed for the newspaper. Some of them they've infiltrated our community, and you'll find hate, at every corner, essentially. Unfortunately, that has really been underscored actually since, in the last 5 or 6 years, when we've seen events like Charlottesville and of course the January 6th insurrection. I mean, many of the people that were there, some of them obviously are just diehard Donald Trump supporters, but many of them there were sucked into this vortex because of their white supremacy belief, because they believe our borders, are being overrun by, illegal folks who shouldn't be here, and which was the same message that Butler talked about back when he was, practicing at his church. He said that the reason that he wanted a whites-only homeland in the Northwest was that folks were flooding in from the southern border, and now it's become a message that's been picked up by a certain political party. It's worth mentioning, I can't not say this, but very integral to the entire message of the Aryan Nations was just a deep thread of anti-Semitism. Here is one of their members. His name is Sean Winkler. He's now moved to Mississippi and is still involved in far right activities, Klan activities, and so forth down there. But he's on a main thoroughfare in Spokane, talking about saying that foreign aid to Israel equals terrorism. And so they would, at every opportunity, they would be very anti-Semitic. very anti-Israel. Their hatred for the Jewish race was and ethnicity is just it's hard to describe. For example, when we went to the Aryan Congress, they would put a flag of Israel, a large flag of Israel, on the stair steps going up to this band platform, and their intention was to make members of the media walk over the flag of Israel as sort of a ha-ha moment, I guess. But I would always jump over it and encourage my colleagues, pointing out to them that that was the flag of Israel, and that even though the Aryans were trying to show it some disrespect, or they were showing it disrespect, that we shouldn't, get sucked into that little antic of the Aryans. Butler's last parade was in 2004. He was there sitting in a lawn chair, and it was in, I believe, the summer or late summer of 2004. And not long after this picture, he died of a heart attack. He'd lost his compound. The Aryan nations had been sued by the Southern Poverty Law Center because some of their guards had shot at a woman and her son. A civil suit ensued, and a jury in Coeur d'Alene awarded $4 or $5 million. Butler obviously couldn't pay the civil award. He didn't have the resources to appeal it, so he declared bankruptcy. The bankruptcy court gave the compound to the plaintiffs, and in short order, it was torn down. It is now an open field. One of the other things that I want to wrap up by saying, and that is, frequently over these 40 or so years, I would hear from various folks, sometimes even fellow journalists, the notion of, well, why don't you just ignore these people? They'll go away. It's no big deal. They've got a right to their own opinion. Why don't we just sort of ignore them, and maybe they'll just be okay. And in fact, one of the Spokane paper's competitors, another newspaper in the region, was owned by a wealthy businessman. And he instructed the newspaper that he owned to sort of did not cover them, to not write about them, not tell the community they were there, and pretend they didn't exist, because it was bad for business. And he owned a hotel and a golf course. But civil rights people, who I would go to sort of get to sound this out on them. What do you do? How do you write about these people? And my own personal, bottom line or litmus test was, if they've committed crimes and they're in the court system, then yes, we need to write about them. If they're committing murders or robberies, printing counterfeit money, and there are federal indictments and there are arrests, or there's violence, they're plotting to bomb a gay bar somewhere, all of which happened. So when I look at those stories that I wrote, there was some sort of criminal activity. We weren't just willy-nilly writing about them. But Bill Wassmoth, the late Bill Wassmoth, who I showed you there, whose home was targeted by members of that had come out of the Aryan nations. He and others would always say that you have to pay them some attention. You can't ignore them. That you don't debate justice, and you don't debate or tolerate oppression. Being inclusive does not mean being inclusive of someone who's hurting someone or who is advocating violence against someone. And we gave Bill's message a big platform, which I think, again, in journalism, putting all this kind of this subject matter in context, you have to reach out to people like the Bill Wassmoths of the world. Find your local human rights advocates. If you're in your own little community dealing with an instance of hate, reach out to those people locally. And if there are none that are organized and are willing to say anything, then go to the national level and find people from the different human and civil rights organizations who are willing to talk about it. Morris Dees, likewise, at Southern Poverty Law Center, said, if you ignore them, they'll go away. That's a heads in the sand approach. Anyway, he goes on to go into details so that you can read for yourself, but that particularly small towns and small communities, when they are hit with, suddenly a skinhead group shows up, or a militia group, or the Proud Boys, or whatever, is reach out to other voices and don't ignore them. So I think I have one other thing, and this is on a light note. People often ask me, so in all your years of doing this, what have you walked away with? And I really didn't walk away with much. It's all up here. But one of the things that I found, one of the white supremacist fugitives who was wanted for murder was trying to start his own little Ruby Ridge, and he hated the government. He hated Zog. Talked about Zog, how the Jews are controlling everything. And so I went to his campsite up and I hiked in a ways, quite a ways actually, with a photographer. And there at his campsite was this can of pork and beans. And if you look closely, it's from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's, you know, it's a government handout food. So he took beans and filled his stomach, you know, thanks to Zog, but he hated Zog. And then after the beans were gone, he shot bullet holes in it. And that's sort of, I think there's sort of, you know, an ironic message there is that these folks, even though they hate Zog, that they're the first ones in line for anything that the government's willing to do for them. So I've talked on too long, Ken. I apologize. I'm going to turn it back over to you. Maybe we can squeeze in a question or two here quickly.
Sure, we will. And I want to, you know, thank you for that, Bill. And I want to make a quick comment, and then I'll ask you a question, then we'll go to other questions, maybe go, you know, 5 minutes after the hour too. But that was amazing how much material you put through. What I wanted to emphasize for the audience is just how this is a beat that requires expertise and dedication. Too many times, I think people that cover hate and hate groups just think, I can expose this, I can ask a question. And it's like writing about economics or writing about healthcare or writing about other things. You need some level of expertise. And in some ways, even more, because what struck me about your writing was it reflected to me, you had the imagination to not only understand what these guys were saying, but to sort of figure out, if I were seeing the world from their point of view, what would I see? Which helped, I think, you write about this with a lot more clarity. It wasn't just, this is awful stuff I want to dismiss. They have a worldview, and you have to engage it and understand it in order to write about it and make people see about it. But the one question I want to ask you, then I'll go to the ones that we have queued up, is that, you know, as your picture showed of the people that were outside of Ruby Ridge and the one later with the woman with the KKK hat, you weren't writing like for the New York Times, which had a more liberal audience. You were writing for people for whom these folks were neighbors. You know, you didn't talk about Buford Furrow, who also came out of the Aryan nations, was the guy who shot up the JCC in LA in '99. I mean, I know people in northern Idaho and eastern Montana. I know people who were school teachers Buford Furrow used to babysit for. And then, how could this guy do that? So these were neighbors. And, you know, what was the trick when you wrote about this so that people could really see this as something that was important for understanding in their community, but not that you were, you know, us versus them vilifying these folks. You were making them human and understandable as neighbors. How did you do that?
Well, the best way to do that is to let them talk, and take your notepad or your tape recorder or your television camera and let their own words essentially hang themselves. And I would do that with Butler. You know, Butler called me a race traitor. My grandparents are from Norway and Sweden. I have blonde hair, what's left of it, and blue eyes. And he thought I should be one of them. And I said, no, I'm not part and parcel of what you're all about. I steadfastly oppose it, but I'll treat you fairly. And so there were occasions when I was actually confronted by, spat upon, had weapons pulled on me. And I would always say, look, I'm not here to argue with you, even though I don't agree with what you're all about. My job is I'm not a civic protest organizer. I'm a journalist. I'm trying to record history, and I want to know what you're all about. And so I would just try to quote them, with their own words. I didn't quite catch the case you're referring to out of Montana. Were you referring to the Buford Furrow case?
Yeah.
The Buford Furrow case. So I'd paid him attention. And again, this only because the newspaper gave me so much time and the ability over the years to track this. I saw Buford Furrow at one of these Aryan World Congresses. And I, through news gathering and through reporting and speaking with federal agents and neighbors and so forth, I found out that Buford Furrow had married the widow of Bob Matthews. And I was interested, okay, is this a new order, a new leader of the order? And Debbie Matthews, Robert Matthews' widow, has married this man. And so I asked the photographer that I was with that day, I said, get a picture of that guy. And so years later, when Buford Furrow went on this spree and shot up a Jewish daycare center in Los Angeles and murdered a person of color who was a mail carrier, I remembered him. And it's only because I'd, spent all that time doing this and spent those 3, Friday, Saturday, Sunday standing on a dusty county road. So it's sort of like, a sports reporter, for example. This is for our field, but if you got a sports reporter who covers the same baseball team year after year after year, he or she's going to know, do they have any good pitchers? How many of the old returning players are coming back? Who's got the big bats? Who's going to bat number 4? It's the same thing in this world that I covered. So I've got that. The newspaper allowed me, and I credit the Coles family and the publishers of the Spokesman Review and the editors that I work for giving me that latitude to develop that depth. So developing depth is very important.
Right. Thank you, Bill. So I'm going to just tick off a couple of questions that I can answer quickly and then put some to you. And I think we're going to go to about, if you're willing, to about 10 minutes after. So these are great questions and I want to get them in. So one says, do you have a book or repository for your article that you could access? I will answer that. You and I were talking before, you're working on a book, and I think that would be great. I'm also glad that you showed the Common Courage book, which I encourage people to read about Bill Wassmoth, who is very much a hero. So until Bill Morlin's book comes out, read the book about Bill Wassmoth, but read Bill Morlin's book when it comes out. This couple from reporters, so let me read them. I'm a reporter in Maine and written a bit about the local militia groups that are extremely secretive, but I know they exist. What tips do you have for reporters in such communities where militia and other far-right extremists exist, but are on the lowdown? And the other is, I researched white supremacy groups for a long time. It's an odd curiosity. I'm currently working as a journalist in Oregon, following these groups in the Pacific Northwest. Thank you for extensive work and understanding of these groups and their ideologies. I have found that women connected to these groups have had a large influence and is often ignored and less unknown. Is there a reason that women affiliated with these groups are not reported in the news?
Well, I'll take the militia question first. The most important thing, and this is very difficult to do, is identify the individuals you think that are involved. And the perplexing question for journalists is, at least the code of ethics that I subscribe to, the Society of Professional Journalists, is we can't pretend to be somebody we're not. So I can't go on Facebook or Instagram and develop a false identity. I've got to maintain my own identity as a journalist. I can't use pseudonyms. But in the world of informants, some of those informants do use false identities. And it pays to find out who those informants are and what information they can provide you. Sometimes informants who are supplying law enforcement with information are also willing to share that information with journalists whose work they trust and respect. So reach out, find out who might be monitoring these groups. And the younger generation really has a great advantage in terms of being wizards with social. I mean, at Charlottesville, for example, they were using some social media apps that were encrypted. I mean, you really have to have a computer science degree really to keep track of all the tricks that are coming out of the bag. So become a social media expert, reach out for informants, develop ties or connections or inroads with law enforcement people, both at the state, local, and federal level. Not all of them will talk to you, some of them will. You just have to be imaginative and creative. As for the issue of women in the movement, it's a great question, tough topic to break through, because the people in this orbit believe women should be home having Aryan babies and that they should be in the background, plain and simple. And so getting out and reaching to them and talking to them and getting them, being able to interview them is just a huge task. When the skinheads started showing up at the Aryan Nation, some of the younger skinhead women would occasionally talk to the media, but it's in that orbit of hate, it's really a man's world, and they think women are subordinate and should be subordinate and should never talk. Plus, they all think that all members of the media, regardless of who you are or which organization you work for, or even if you're a private researcher, they all think that we all work for the Jewish interests, and there's no way to dispel that. And they are suspicious. They are threatening. I was spat upon had guns pointed at me. They don't like the media, and which again, it's another a message that we heard not long ago, is that the media is the enemy of the American public. Now, some parallels there. I'll let you draw your own conclusions.
Thank you, Bill. Next question is, there is a prominent narrative that reporting on white nationalism began in 2016 when these stories began to enter national mainstream media. What can national outlets learn from the long history of local reporting on these issues? How might we have a larger national audience impact the way we report on white supremacism and white nationalism?
I agree with the question that yes, by 2016, at the national level, we saw some of these same messages that Butler was talking about, with the words only slightly changed, creeping into the national political discussion. And journalists that know that and can go back and recoup what Butler said years ago should point that out. And this, when somebody's talking about murderers and rapists, crossing the Mexican border, it's not that much different than Richard Butler saying, and his words were, mongrel hordes are flooding into the U.S. from Mexico. I mean, not much difference. So when those stories appear, and when you see a noose on January 6th, it's just not an innocent noose there. I mean, these people were getting their inspiration from the Turner Diaries and the day of the rope. But again, if you don't understand all that, then reach out to guys like who's sharing the screen with me, Ken Stern, and the folks at ADL or Southern Poverty Law Center, Simon Wiesenthal. There are experts out there that can fill you in on some of this stuff. There aren't many, but the people that are out there, their hair is as gray as mine. And reach out when you're coming across these kind of stories. Don't pick up the phone or send an email and do some research. Don't be lazy.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine two. One is what's a good way to start researching a far right group? And second is, how would you recommend student reporters engage with these topics from far right groups, even from the bubble of a liberal campus? How do we approach them if we are the types of people who they hate?
Well, you need to start reading. I mean, the secret to writing and reporting really is reading. And you'll see the bookcases behind me are full of incredibly well done books, for the most part, about the far right, from the Klan to the National Alliance to National Socialism. You need to become an expert at the subject. And so, in the evening, instead of watching a TV show, crack open a book, start reading, start. If you really want to do this long term, you ought to start collecting a library and not just putting them on a shelf. You need to read them. Also, look at the literature or the web postings or the blogs or whatever you get your hands on. Some of it's secret or it's behind privacy settings, but read what they're saying. And it may be something simple. I mean, for example, how many white supremacists and anti-government extremists have really infiltrated the anti-vax movement? I mean, now that's a perfect question that, if I were currently working for one of the national media outlets, or even on the local level, if you've got a local newspaper and you got a lot of anti-vaxxers, how many of them, where did they come from? Have they been involved in some of these militia groups, some of these white supremacy groups? Who are they? And fortunately, we've seen a lot of that with the 500 plus individuals that have been arrested for January 6th. A lot of them, their stripes are showing now. But it took those arrests and those indictments so we get a glimpse as to who are these people. So you have to use every resource that's out there. And I got to tell you, in today's day and age, you got a lot more resources than I did in the 80s and 90s before the birth of the internet.
Really, just follow up for the second part of that question for the student journalist, because it strikes me that, as you were saying correctly, you walked into these groups, their theory of journalism's are working for the great Jewish conspiracy, you're a part of it, yet they let you interview them. So the student's question was basically premised on, if I'm coming as a college reporter and there's a local group, they're going to be suspicious of me. But how do you get past that? Is it because the groups still want the publicity regardless, so they're willing to deal with you? Or, do you put on a smile and get through their different, how would you advise this young reporter to get the information from direct interviews?
Well, I mean, I presume that they're writing about them because they've done something, or they're going to do something. They're going to host a meeting. They're going to host a speaker. I wouldn't advocate just a willy-nilly profile on these people just for the hell of it. I mean, as I told you, the stories that I wrote on the Aryan nations over the year, it's because something happened. They did a criminal act. So there's got to be a why. Why are you doing this? And you use that as your foot in the door when you go talk to them and say, look, we want to know, why are you bringing this Holocaust denier speaker to campus? Why do you think, how much money is it costing? Who's paying for this person? And why do you think this college campus or this high school or whatever the format is, why? And what is this? And then get into deeper questions. Don't you think this is fanning the flames of anti-Semitism and of hatred by doing this? And obviously, the free speech issues, but you have to be engaging. And I found that the secret to this is that, number one, not a phone call, in person if possible, COVID notwithstanding. And once you engage them, I mean, have a tape recorder in your hand that's visible and a notebook, and don't let them stop talking. If they say no comment, you just keep peppering them with questions. A phone call, they could say, screw you, done. No, you go knock on their door in person, and you tell them, look, I took the time to come out of my office or out of my dorm to go see you. You're important for me to understand what this is all about. Why are you doing what you're doing? And so you're essentially appealing to you're flattering them in a way, is that you are so important that I want to hear what you're all about. Tell me your message. I'm not here to agree with your message, but tell me what it's about, and tell me what you hope to accomplish by doing this.
Great, thank you. And I'll ask one final question, and then I'll let you go and everybody else. So during the 1960s, it was known that the KKK had links to the police. Could you address the links nowadays between white extremists and local law enforcement officials in the military?
Well, I mean, I know about that. I can't hold myself out to be an expert on that topic, but yes, a lot of Timothy McVeigh, for example, was trained in the U.S. Army. A lot of the folks that we saw at the Aryan nations, many of them had military backgrounds. The Phineas priests that I talked about that bombed the newspaper, some of them had been in the military. The military, it gives people a lot of training regarding firearms and weaponry and explosives. And some people, once they get out of the military, for whatever reason, they can't unplug that component, and it somehow takes over. But we've also seen, and there've been just a couple of recent examples. I wish I could remember one where where current law enforcement officers are also secretly members of some of these organizations, and those stories need to be jumped on. And maybe you can help me out, but there was just one within the last week or two.
Yeah, the Oath Keepers are part of that.
Oh yeah, the Oath, yeah. Police officers that were in Oath Keepers. There were several, I think 3 or 4 police officers from Seattle who were involved in the January 6th insurrection. And so those are the sort of inroads that you can use to find out who is this individual, and then go to the police departments or go to the oversight people, the city council members or the mayor or city manager or whoever it might be, and say, what's with this? I mean, what kind of background check did you do when you hired these people? Are you allowing people that are espousing hatred and extremism to be members of your department? And then you'll see many times that some of those same departments are rife with their own bigotry and hatred within the department, as we've just seen in a couple of departments.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everybody for staying a little bit longer. But I really appreciate going through a massive amount of material and expertise. And I really look forward to finishing the book that you're going to write, because I can't think of anybody else who can analyze the whole sort of arc of white supremacy from the 80s and making it relevant today, and part of it, so much of it being from your, through your eyes, through your ears, just, through your brain. Just so much memoir, I suspect, will be in this book too. And I'm really looking forward to that. And thank you, Bill. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. And to everybody who registered, you will get tomorrow an email with a link to this recording. I encourage you to share it widely. Anyway, have a good afternoon, everybody. Take care.
Thank you, Ken.
Okay, thank you.